Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
Who has visited Northumberland without walking happily beside the lovely Coquette River? This little river is sometimes calm, moving softly over the rocks. But when it rains, the river becomes wild, rushing fast and strong toward the ocean. Anyone who knows this river will remember Hareton Priory, a beautiful estate beside the water. The land is surrounded by hills on three sides, protecting it from cold winds. It slopes gently toward the river. The house is large and built in the old Tudor style. Nearby, the ruins of the first priory still stand. Long ago, monks lived there, but King Henry VIII gave the land to Ralph de Hareton. His family had owned it ever since. Each generation improved the estate. When the story begins, Mr. Richard Hareton is the owner. He spent a lot of money changing and rebuilding the house, though some neighbors thought he was spending too much. However, no one could deny that the priory and its gardens were beautiful. It was spring turning into summer, and the flowers were in full bloom. The estate, hidden by tall hills, looked like a fairy tale. A young man, Frank Dormer, lay on the soft green grass under a large tree. Mr. Hareton had met Frank walking in the area. When he learned that Frank had mutual friends in London, he kindly invited him to stay. Frank had planned to read in the library that morning, but the singing birds, warm sunlight, and sweet-smelling roses drew him outside. Frank had never seen such a beautiful place before. He might never see it again. Soon, he would sail to India for his new job in the civil service. He had been an orphan since childhood. His relatives did not care for him much. He had moved from school to tutor, then to college, never knowing a real home until now. The weeks at the priory had been the happiest of his life. As he lay there, he remembered riding with Mr. Hareton to visit nearby places, meeting friendly landowners, and taking quiet drives with Mrs. Hareton, who was always unwell. Most of all, he thought of his fun walks and playful moments with Florence, the Haretons' only daughter. He sighed, shading his eyes. Suddenly, a small hand pushed aside the tree branches. A bright, mischievous face appeared, then disappeared. A moment later, flower petals rained down on him. Laughing, Frank shook them off and looked around, but Florence had already run away, hiding nearby, her giggles giving her away. "Come out, Miss Mischief," Frank called, "unless you're running to get a broom before Johnson sees this mess. He cleaned the lawn just 2 hours ago. He'll tell Mr. Hareton about your untidy ways. I hope you get extra math problems and a long German lesson as punishment." Florence stepped out, smiling. She was a slim, delicate girl of 15, with deep blue eyes, almost black, and long, wavy golden-brown hair tied loosely with a matching ribbon. She studied with a strict governess for hours each day to become a proper young lady. But her mother, who was often unwell, made sure she also had plenty of free time. Growing up at the priory, away from visitors and their compliments, Florence remained a happy, innocent child. Still, she had one secret thought. If she ever left her mother and married, it must be to someone like Frank Dormer. Because she was young and Frank would soon leave. No one stopped them from spending time together. They walked, sang, and read books side by side. Florence shared her small troubles with Frank, trusting him with all her little secrets. For Frank, who had never spent much time with women before, she was like a younger sister to care for. Only Mrs. Harriton noticed how fond he was becoming of her. "I wouldn't add lying to my other bad habits if I were you," Florence said playfully, stepping closer but ready to run if Frank tried to catch her. "I didn't throw those leaves, Mr. Dormer. I would never upset poor Johnson, especially now that I need his best flowers for my garden. You made the mess by shaking them off the tree. You should pick them up at once. Then come help me, mademoiselle." "Oh no, monsieur. That would mean I admit guilt. I'm going for a walk. Mr. Dormer, I saw a beautiful fern growing on the hill by the river. It's about a mile away and I want to get it. Will you come?" Frank put on his hat and followed as she danced across the lawn, humming and picking flowers. She made a small bouquet and pinned it to his coat. "Miss Dodson says every flower has a meaning," she said. "Do you know what these mean?" "To me, they mean something special. They are the last flowers I will take from an English garden," Frank replied. "I will try to dry them and keep them in India." "Was that what you were thinking about when I found you?" Florence asked softly. "Why must you leave? Why not stay in England?" "I must go, Florence," Frank said gently. "This job is my only chance to succeed. I have no friends to help me, no important connections." He stopped and smiled. "But don't worry your little head about such things. I understand that you will be gone for years," Florence said sadly. "Mama is very upset, and so am I. But Papa has friends. He could help you. I'll go ask him now." She dropped her basket and started running, but Frank quickly caught her arm. "Florence, my dear little girl, you must not do that. Promise me you won't ask your father to help me." "But don't you believe he would?" she asked, frowning. "I know he would," Frank replied. "He has been very kind to me. Then why not let him?" "Hush, say no more," Frank said firmly. "I want to leave this place with happy memories, not painful ones." Florence saw the sadness in his face. He had never spoken about his past troubles before. She decided to change the subject and make him smile again. She ran into the woods to look for a bird's nest, challenged him to a race, and even played hide and seek behind the trees. Each time she returned to his side, her smile was softer, her voice gentler, as if she wanted to make him forget his worries. Their walk took longer than expected, but at last, they reached the hill where the rare fern grew. While Frank carefully dug around the roots, Florence ran to the edge of the steep cliff to look at the river below. Frank suddenly felt uneasy. "Be careful, Florence," he shouted. "The ground is not safe. If you fall, it could be deadly." As she turned to answer him, The ground beneath her feet crumbled. A large rock gave way and she disappeared. Frank's heart nearly stopped. He ran to the edge expecting the worst. But then he saw her, clinging desperately to a small bush halfway down the cliff. Her face was as pale as his. He clenched his fists, thinking fast. He couldn't reach her from above. The only way to save her was to climb up from the bottom. But that would take time. Would she hold on? "Florence, listen to me," he called firmly. "Do exactly as I say." Her wide eyes filled with hope, then fear. I'll try. Please, save me." "I will, but you must be brave. Think of your mother. She needs you." Florence shuddered, then nodded. "I'll do what you say." "Good. Don't look down. Keep your eyes on me. Move your hands slowly. Yes, now your foot. There are roots below you. They will hold you until I come." Florence was afraid to move. She felt that even the smallest shift could make her fall. But when Frank spoke again, his voice firm and clear, she obeyed. Slowly, she changed her position and found a more secure hold. "Now stay there without moving. Don't look down. I will come as fast as I can. Promise me this," Frank said. "Yes," Florence answered. "I'm not so scared now. I will think of my mother until you return." Frank took one last look at her pale face before rushing down the steep path. He stumbled over rocks, his hands bleeding, his clothes tearing. But he didn't stop. Every second felt too long. When he reached the bottom, he hesitated, afraid of what he might see. But Florence was still there, holding onto the heather. Her head had dropped, and she was moaning softly. "Hold on, Florence," he called. Using all his strength, Frank climbed up to her. He was a skilled climber, but carrying her down would be difficult. When he reached her, she was too weak to move. Gently, he put his arm around her. "I've got you now," he said. "Just follow my instructions, and we'll get down safely." She nodded and did as he said. Step by step, he guided her until they reached a large rock near the river. He helped her sit, then cupped cool water in his hands to wash her face. Slowly, her color returned. Florence looked up at the cliff and realized how close she had come to falling. The thought of what could have happened to her parents, filled her with fear. She leaned against Frank's shoulder and began to cry softly. "Mr. Dormer, I want to thank you," she whispered, "but I don't know how." Frank held her close for a moment. "I should have never let you go near the edge alone," he said. "If anything had happened to you, I could never forgive myself." Realizing his own emotions, he quickly stepped back and helped her stand. "We must go home," he said. "Mama will be worried," Florence added. "How will I tell her?" "Wait until I've gone," Frank said. "And promise me, never take such a risk again." "I promise," she said. At the door, she held his hand. "I wish I had something to give you to remember today." "Wait until I return," Frank said softly. If you are still the same Florence, I will ask for something more precious than jewels. The dinner bell rang, and Florence ran inside.